is her house? It's completely vanished.
What's that sound?
Sarah.
Important notice. The story you are about to hear is 100% fiction, created exclusively for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are completely invented. There was no Sarah Crane, no house disappeared in Kansas in 1888, and none of the narrated events actually happened. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is pure coincidence. This is a fictional horror story in documentary style. Now, let's begin. At sunrise, one house was missing. Not burned, not collapsed, not abandoned. Missing. No foundation, no debris, no trace that it ever existed, except for the 73 people who remembered seeing it the day before. Before we dive into one of the most disturbing mysteries in American frontier history, tell us in the comments, where are you watching this from? And if stories like this send chills down your spine, hit that subscribe button, because what happened in Kansas in 1888 will make you question everything you thought you knew about the land beneath your feet. This is the story of Sarah Crane's house, and the three neighbors who wished they'd never gone looking for answers. The Kansas plains in April 1888 stretched like an ocean, frozen in earth and grass, endless, unforgiving, a place where the sky pressed down with such weight that men built their homes low to the ground, as if trying to hide from God's gaze. Thomas Merrick woke that Tuesday morning the same way he had for 6 years, before dawn, joints aching, the smell of dirt and old wood filling his nostrils. His wife, Catherine, was already moving in the kitchen of their farmhouse, the clatter of iron pots, a familiar morning symphony. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside. The sun was just breaking the horizon, painting the world in shades of copper and gold. Thomas squinted across the landscape, performing his daily ritual of surveying the neighboring properties. To the north, the Anderson family's barn stood dark against the brightening sky. To the east, he could see smoke rising from the Lewis's chimney. To the west, there should have been Sarah Crane's house. Thomas blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked again. Nothing. Just prairie grass swaying in the morning breeze, as if the small wooden structure had never existed at all. "Catherine!" His voice cracked as he called back into the house. "Catherine, come here!" His wife appeared in the doorway, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "What is it?" "Sarah's house." Thomas pointed with a trembling finger. It's not there." Catherine stepped beside him, her eyes following his gesture. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the scent of turned earth and something else, something Thomas couldn't quite identify, something ancient. "Maybe she moved," Catherine whispered, but her voice betrayed her disbelief. "In the middle of the night? Without a word?" Thomas shook his head. "We saw her yesterday afternoon, remember? She was hanging laundry." They had seen her. Thomas could picture it clearly. Sarah Crane, 47 years old, widowed 3 years prior, her dark hair streaked with grey, hanging white sheets on the line behind her house. She'd waved. Catherine had waved back. That house had stood there for 8 years. Thomas had helped Sarah's late husband Robert raise the frame. He remembered the sound of hammers, the smell of fresh-cut pine, Robert's laugh when they'd finally gotten the roof beam in place. Now there was nothing, not even a foundation. By mid-morning, the news had spread. Neighbors began arriving on horseback and in wagons, drawn by rumor and disbelief. First came Jacob and Margaret Lewis from the east, their faces pale with confusion. Then the Anderson boys rode over from the north, Samuel, 19, and his younger brother David, barely 16. They all stood in a rough semicircle, staring at the emptiness where Sarah Crane's house should have been. "Did anybody see anything?" Jacob Lewis asked, his weathered farmer's hands clenched into fists. "Hear anything?" Heads shook. Murmurs of no rippled through the small crowd. "A house doesn't just disappear," Margaret Lewis said, her voice sharp with fear poorly disguised as anger. "Houses don't just vanish." Young David Anderson walked slowly toward the empty space, his boots crushing the prairie grass. The others watched him, holding their collective breath. When he reached the spot where Sarah's front porch should have been, he knelt down, running his hands over the ground. "The grass," he called back. "It's not even disturbed, like nothing was ever here." But something caught his eye. 20 feet from where the house had stood, there was a structure they'd all seen 100 times, Sarah's well. A simple stone circle, 3 feet in diameter, descending into darkness. David approached it slowly. The others began to follow, drawn by curiosity and dread in equal measure. Thomas reached the well first, joining David at its edge. Together, they peered down into the blackness. The morning sun did nothing to illuminate its depths. "Sarah!" Thomas called down, his voice echoing strangely against the stone walls. "Sarah Crane, can you hear me?" The echo came back distorted, wrong somehow, not quite matching the words he'd spoken. "We need to get the sheriff," Catherine said from behind them. This isn't natural." Jacob Lewis nodded grimly. "Samuel, you ride to town, fast as you can. We need the law out here." The young man ran to his horse, and within moments the sound of hoofbeats was fading toward Junction City, 15 miles to the southeast. The remaining neighbors stood in uneasy silence, their eyes moving between the empty space and the well. The wind had picked up, and Thomas could swear he heard something in it, not quite voices, but not quite not voices either. A susurration that made the hair on his neck stand up. "I saw her yesterday," Margaret Lewis said quietly, almost to herself. "Clear as day. She was real. The house was real." "We all saw it," Thomas replied. But even as he said it, he felt a creeping doubt. Had they? Or had they seen what they expected to see, what should have been there? Catherine moved closer to her husband, her fingers finding his arm and gripping tight. "Thomas, I want to go home." He nodded, but found himself unable to move. His eyes kept returning to that well, that dark circle in the earth that suddenly seemed less like a source of water and more like a mouth, a throat, a passage to somewhere that shouldn't exist. "Look at the grass," David Anderson said suddenly, pointing. "Around the well, it's different." Thomas followed the boy's gesture. David was right. In a perfect circle around the well, extending out about 6 feet in every direction, the grass was darker, greener, as if it had been fed. "We should cover it," Jacob said, "until the sheriff gets here. Cover the well." "With what?" Thomas asked. No one had an answer. They stood there as the sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows, warming the earth. But Thomas felt cold, deep in his bones cold. The kind of cold that came from knowing, truly knowing, that the world wasn't what you thought it was, that the land you'd broken and planted and called your own might have other ideas about who possessed whom. As noon approached, the neighbors began to drift back to their own properties, needing to attend to livestock and chores, but promising to return. Thomas and Catherine walked slowly back to their house, neither speaking. When Thomas looked back over his shoulder, the well stood alone on the empty prairie, a dark eye watching the sky. And somewhere deep below, something might have been watching back. Sheriff William Morrison arrived just after 2 o'clock, accompanied by Samuel Anderson and a man Thomas didn't recognize, tall, thin, wearing a dark suit despite the dust and heat. The stranger carried a leather satchel and had the calculating eyes of someone who made his living from other people's misfortunes. "This is Mr. Edward Finch," Morrison announced as he dismounted, "land surveyor from Topeka. I thought we might need his expertise." The sheriff was a solid man in his 50s, with a grey mustache and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades dealing with frontier disputes. but Thomas could see uncertainty in his eyes as he surveyed the empty space. "Show me exactly where the house stood," Morrison said. Thomas led him to the spot, pacing out the dimensions from memory. Foundation was here. Front door faced east. The well you can see there, that's real enough. Finch was already unpacking his instruments, setting up a surveyor's transit on a wooden tripod. He worked with methodical precision, taking measurements, making notes in a small leather journal. "According to county records," Finch said without looking up, "Sarah Crane filed a homestead claim here in 1880, 160 acres. The claim shows a dwelling structure, a well, and approximately 12 acres under cultivation." He paused, finally lifting his eyes to the empty land. "The well is documented. The house is documented. The property taxes have been paid annually. But the house isn't here," Morrison stated the obvious. "No, Sheriff, it is not." They walked the perimeter of where the house had stood, all of them looking for something, anything that might explain what had happened. Finch knelt occasionally, examining the soil, pulling up blades of grass to inspect their roots. "The earth hasn't been disturbed," he finally concluded. "No excavation. No foundation removed. It's as if—" He trailed off, seemingly reluctant to finish the thought. As if what?" Morrison pressed. "As if nothing was ever here," Finch admitted quietly. By now, the neighbors had returned, along with several others from farther out who'd heard the news. Nearly 24 people stood in a loose gathering, watching the sheriff and the surveyor work. "What about Mrs. Crane herself?" Morrison asked. "Anyone seen her? Any sign of where she might have gone?" More shaking heads, Thomas spoke up. "She had family back in Ohio, I think. A sister, maybe, but she never talked about leaving. Did she seem troubled lately? Worried about anything?" The neighbors exchanged glances. Finally, Catherine spoke. "She was quiet. She'd been quiet since Robert died. But not strange. Not like she was planning something." Morrison walked to the well, peering down into its depths. "Someone get me a lantern and a rope." David Anderson ran to fetch the items from his family's wagon. Within minutes, Morrison had lit the lantern and was lowering it slowly into the well, the rope playing out through his weathered hands. Thomas watched the light descend, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a distant spark in the darkness below. "How deep is this well?" Morrison called out. "Robert dug it himself," Thomas replied. "Hit water at about 40 feet, as I recall." But the lantern kept descending. 50 feet, 60, 70. The rope kept playing out, and the light kept shrinking. "That's not right," Morrison muttered. He tied off the rope to a stake and straightened up, his face troubled. "That's not right at all." Finch had been making his rounds, interviewing the gathered neighbors. Now he approached the sheriff with his journal open. "I've spoken with 17 people," Finch reported. "All of them remember seeing Sarah Crane and her house as recently as yesterday. All provide consistent descriptions. The house was a single-story structure, wood frame, painted white with green shutters, approximately 20 feet by 24 feet. Stone chimney on the north side." "So it was here," Morrison said. "According to every witness, yes. According to the physical evidence?" Finch gestured at the empty ground. "No." A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone, Thomas couldn't see who, spoke from the back. "Maybe we're all remembering wrong. Maybe it's been gone longer than we think." "I saw her yesterday," Margaret Lewis said firmly. "I waved to her. She waved back." "I delivered eggs to her last week," added another neighbor, a woman named Ruth Porter. "Went right up to her door, knocked. She invited me in for coffee." "Did you go inside?" Morrison asked sharply. Ruth paused, her brow furrowing. I meant to, but I was in a hurry. I left the eggs on the porch and... No, I didn't go in." Anyone else? Anyone actually been inside the house recently? Silence. Uncomfortable shifting. Thomas realized with a creeping horror that he couldn't remember the last time he'd actually entered Sarah's house. He'd seen it hundreds of times, passed it regularly, waved to Sarah when she was outside. But inside, not since Robert's funeral, 3 years ago. That doesn't mean anything, Catherine said, reading his thoughts. People keep to themselves out here, that's normal. But was it? Thomas tried to recall specific details about Sarah's house, the interior, the furniture. He could picture the outside clearly enough, but the inside remained frustratingly hazy in his memory. As the afternoon wore on, Sheriff Morrison organized a search of the surrounding area. Men fanned out across the prairie, looking for any sign of Sarah Crane, any evidence of what might have happened. They searched until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and deep purple. They found nothing. As darkness fell, Morrison gathered everyone together. "I'm going to file a report with the county. Missing person, suspicious circumstances. Until we know more, I'm asking everyone to stay alert. If you see anything unusual, hear anything strange, you come to me immediately." "What about the well?" Jacob Lewis asked. Morrison looked at the dark circle of stones, barely visible now in the twilight. "We'll seal it tomorrow. Nobody goes near it until then." But as the crowd dispersed, returning to their homes by lantern light, Thomas saw young David Anderson lingering near the well, standing just at the edge of that circle of darker grass. "David!" Thomas called. "Come away from there!" The boy turned, his face pale in the lamplight. "Mr. Merrick, do you hear it?" "Hear what?" "The well. It's singing." Thomas approached cautiously, his own lantern held high. As he drew closer, he did hear something, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Not quite a sound, more like a vibration felt in the chest, in the bones. "It's just the wind," Thomas said, not believing his own words. "Going down the shaft, creates strange echoes." But there was no wind. The night air was perfectly still. David looked at him with eyes too old for his 16 years. "My grandmother used to tell stories about places in the old country where the ground was thin, where things could slip through." "Stories," Thomas said firmly. "Just stories." He led the boy away, back toward where Samuel was waiting with their horses. But as they left, Thomas felt it too, that hum, that vibration, that sense of something vast and patient waiting below. That night, Thomas lay awake beside his sleeping wife, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the Kansas wind had picked up, whistling around the corners of the house, but underneath that familiar sound, he could swear he heard something else, something that sounded almost like his name. 3 days passed. Sarah Crane did not return. Her house did not reappear. Sheriff Morrison came back twice more, each time with different people, a federal marshal, a doctor from Junction City, even a professor from the State University in Lawrence who claimed expertise in geological anomalies. They all examined the site, took measurements, made notes, and left with more questions than answers. The well remained open, despite Morrison's promise to seal it. Every attempt failed in strange ways. The boards brought to cover it split and warped overnight. The ropes used to lower a wooden cap frayed and snapped. On the third attempt, the cap itself, a heavy circle of oak planking, simply disappeared into the well's depths without a sound. After that, Morrison ordered everyone to stay away. But Thomas couldn't. Some compulsion drew him back each day, standing at a safe distance, watching the well as if expecting it to do something, reveal something. On the 4th morning, he found he wasn't alone. Edward Finch, the surveyor, was there before dawn, setting up his instruments in the grey pre-light. The man looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept. "Mr. Merrick?" Finch greeted him without surprise. "I wondered if you'd come." "Can't seem to help it," Thomas admitted. "You? Professional curiosity and something else." Finch adjusted his transit, sighting along some invisible line. "I've been reviewing county records, going back 30 years. This land has a history." Thomas moved closer. "What kind of history?" "Before the Homestead Act, this area was part of the Carr River watershed, considered sacred ground by the Kanza tribe. They had a name for this particular section." Finch consulted his notes. "The translation is imprecise, but it roughly means where the earth breathes." "Superstition," Thomas said. "Perhaps, but the records show something interesting. Between 1862 and 1885, 11 different homestead claims were filed on this exact parcel. All 160 acres. Sarah and Robert Crane were the 11th. People move on. Farming's hard. All 11 previous claimants disappeared, Mr. Merrick. Not moved away, disappeared. No records of them anywhere else. No death certificates, no property sales. They simply ceased to exist in any documented way." The morning sun was rising now, and Thomas could see Finch's face clearly. The man was frightened. Genuinely deeply frightened, in a way that his professional demeanor couldn't quite hide. "Why didn't anyone notice?" Thomas asked. "Frontier life. People come and go. Records are incomplete. And—" Finch hesitated. "And I suspect people forget. The mind doesn't like loose ends. It ties them up, creates memories of closure where none exists." Thomas thought about his own memories of Sarah's house, how they seemed clear at a distance, but fuzzy up close. How he couldn't quite remember specific details. "What are you suggesting?" he asked quietly. "I'm suggesting that this land takes things, has been taking things for a very long time, and we only notice when something makes us look closely, like a house vanishing overnight." They stood in silence, watching the well. In daylight, it looked ordinary enough, just stones and darkness. But Thomas could feel it, that pull, that wrongness. "There's more," Finch said. "I went through deeds and surveys. The original boundaries of this property don't quite match the current ones. Over time, the parcel has grown, not much, a few feet per decade, but consistently, as if the land itself is expanding." "That's not possible." "No, it's not. But the measurements don't lie." Finch began packing up his equipment. "I've sent my findings to the university, to the Federal Land Office. I'm not sure what they'll do with them, but I've done my duty." "You're leaving?" "I am. And if you're wise, Mr. Merrick, you'll convince your family to do the same. This land—" He looked around at the endless prairie, the big sky, the horizon that went on forever. "It doesn't belong to us. I'm not sure it ever did." Finch departed within the hour. Thomas never saw him again. That evening, a storm rolled in from the west, black clouds piling up like mountains against the sunset, lightning flickering in their depths. The wind rose to a howl, bending the prairie grass flat. Thomas and Catherine secured their animals, battened down shutters, lit lamps against the coming darkness. The storm hit just after nightfall with a fury Thomas had rarely seen. Rain hammered the roof. Wind tore at the corners of the house, making the timbers creak and groan. And through it all, Catherine swore she heard singing. "It's just the wind," Thomas said, repeating his lie from days before. But he heard it too. A chorus of voices, or something like voices, rising and falling with the gusts. Not quite words, not quite music, something older than both. At the height of the storm, there came a knock at the door. Thomas and Catherine froze, staring at each other in the lamplight. The knock came again, insistent, urgent. Thomas took the rifle from above the mantel and approached the door slowly. "Who's there?" No answer, just another knock. He lifted the latch and pulled the door open against the wind. David Anderson stood on the threshold, soaked to the skin, his eyes wild. "Mr. Merrick," the boy gasped, "you have to come. It's Samuel. He went to the well." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. "When?" "An hour ago. He said he heard Mother calling. He took a lantern and a rope and—" David's voice broke. "Please, we need help." Thomas grabbed his coat and hat. Catherine tried to stop him, but he kissed her forehead and promised to be back soon. A promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Outside, the storm raged. Thomas and David ran through the darkness, their lanterns bobbing wildly, rain stinging their faces. The distance to Sarah Crane's property, to the empty space where her house had been, felt both endless and too short. They found Jacob Lewis already there, standing at the edge of the well, holding a rope that descended into darkness. "He went down," Jacob shouted over the wind. "Said he could see light below, said he could hear his mother." "Margaret's been dead for years," Thomas shouted back. "I know!" The anguish in Jacob's voice was raw, but he said he heard her, clear as day, calling him home. Thomas grabbed the rope, feeling the weight on the other end. It was moving, not the sway of a hanging body, but the deliberate movement of someone climbing. "Samuel!" Thomas called down. "Samuel, can you hear me?" The response came faint but unmistakable. "She's here, Mr. Merrick. Mother's here. And Sarah. And others. So many others. They want to show me something beautiful. Samuel, climb up, now." "It's not what we thought. The land. It doesn't take things. It remembers them. Everything that ever was is still here, just deeper. Don't you see? We've been living on the surface, but there's so much more below, so much—" The rope went slack. Thomas hauled it up frantically, hand over hand, the rough fiber burning his palms. But when the end emerged from the well, there was nothing attached. The rope hadn't been cut. It hadn't frayed. It simply ended. David Anderson made a sound like a wounded animal and fell to his knees in the mud. Jacob Lewis's face had gone grey, his hands trembling as he stared at the empty rope. Thunder crashed overhead. Lightning illuminated the prairie in stark white flashes, revealing the landscape in frozen moments. The grass bent horizontal by the wind, the three men huddled around a stone circle, the emptiness stretching in all directions. And in one flash, just one, Thomas could have sworn he saw it. A house, white with green shutters, standing exactly where it should be, there for an instant, then gone. "Did you see that?" David whispered. Thomas had. They all had. The storm began to subside as quickly as it had come, the rain easing to a drizzle, the wind dying to a whisper. In the growing silence, the three men stood around the well, understanding finally settling over them like a shroud. This was not something that could be fixed, not something that could be explained or documented or solved. This was something that simply was. Had always been, would always be. "We need to go," Thomas said quietly. "Now. And we don't look back." They helped each other to their feet and began the walk back to their homes, leaving the well behind. The rope lay coiled on the wet ground like a sleeping snake. Behind them, if they had turned around, but they didn't, they might have seen a figure standing beside the well. A woman in a white dress, her dark hair streaked with grey, watching them leave with eyes that held no judgment, no malice, only patience. Sarah Crane had all the time in the world. By the end of that week, the Anderson family was gone. Jacob Lewis sold his property for a fraction of its value to a land speculator from Kansas City and left before the ink was dry on the deed. The Ruth Porter family departed in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind: furniture, livestock, crops still in the ground. Thomas and Catherine held out for 2 more weeks. It wasn't dramatic. There were no more disappearances, no more storms, no more voices in the night. But the well remained, and the empty space where Sarah's house had been remained, and something about the land itself had changed. The grass grew too green around that circle. The well never reflected the sky, no matter how bright the day, and at night, if you stood on your porch and looked west, you might see lights where no light should be, lamplight glowing from windows that didn't exist. "We can't stay," Catherine said one morning at breakfast. She'd lost weight, dark circles under her eyes from too many sleepless nights. "Thomas, please, we have to go." He wanted to argue. This was their land, their home. They'd worked so hard, endured so much. But when he looked at his wife, really looked at her, he saw the fear that had taken root, the same fear growing in his own chest. "Where would we go?" he asked. "Anywhere. East, back to civilization, somewhere the ground doesn't—" She couldn't finish. That night, Thomas walked one last time to the edge of Sarah Crane's property. He stood at a distance, not approaching the well, just watching the empty space where a house had been. Sheriff Morrison had given up his investigation. The county had classified Sarah Crane as a missing person, though no one was actively looking for her. The land itself had been seized for unpaid taxes, though Thomas noticed no one was rushing to buy it at auction. As he stood there in the twilight, Thomas saw movement, a figure approaching from the north, walking with the steady gait of someone on a long journey. It was Edward Finch, the surveyor, but changed. His suit was torn and dusty, his face gaunt, eyes bright with something between madness and enlightenment. "Mr. Merrick," Finch greeted him, his voice hoarse. "I thought I might find you here. I thought you left, went back to Topeka." "I tried." Finch laughed, a dry, cracking sound. "Made it as far as Junction City before I turned around. Had to come back. Had to understand." "Understand what?" Finch set down the heavy bag he was carrying, his surveying equipment, Thomas realized, along with stacks of papers and journals. "I've been to the territorial archives, read every record I could find about this region, spoke to the few remaining Kansa elders who would talk to me." Finch's hands shook as he pulled out a map, old, hand-drawn, the paper yellow with age. This land was a boundary. The Kansa knew it. The tribes before them knew it. "A place where the world is thin, thin," Thomas repeated, "between what is and what was, between the surface and something else." Finch spread the map on the ground, weighting the corners with stones. "Look here. See these marks? Each one represents a site like this, places where reality doesn't quite hold, where the past doesn't stay buried." Thomas counted 17 marks scattered across what would become Kansas and Nebraska. 17 places. "The Kansa avoided them," Finch continued, "considered them sacred, yes, but also dangerous. They understood that some ground shouldn't be claimed, shouldn't be owned, that the earth has its own purposes. But we built here anyway," Thomas said. "We did, and the land took its payment." Finch looked toward the well, and Thomas saw tears on the surveyor's weathered face. 11 families before the Cranes, probably more before records were kept, all gone, absorbed, remembered by the earth itself. "Why?" Thomas asked. "Why does it take people?" "I don't think it's malicious. I think it's just hungry. Hungry for stories, for lives, for all the things that make us human. We press our existence into the land. Our houses, our farms, our families, and the land presses back, keeps what we give it." Finch began gathering his papers, his maps, stuffing them back into his bag with shaking hands. "What will you do?" Thomas asked. "I'm going to document everything, send it to the university, the government, anyone who'll listen. And then—" He paused, looking at the empty space where Sarah's house had been. "Then I'll probably come back. I can feel it already, the pull. Like the land knows I know its secrets, like it wants to keep me too." They stood together in the gathering darkness, two men who'd looked too closely at something they shouldn't have seen. "Get your wife and leave, Mr. Merrick," Finch said softly. "Tonight, if you can. Don't wait for dawn. This land is patient, but it's also hungry, and hunger grows. Thomas nodded. He walked back to his house without looking back and found Catherine already packing their essential belongings. They left before midnight, taking only what they could carry in their wagon. Thomas didn't lock the door, didn't look back at the farm they'd built with their own hands. Just drove east through the darkness, the horses' hooves beating a steady rhythm against the packed earth. Behind them, the Kansas prairie stretched empty and vast under the stars. The well stood sentinel over the space where a house had been, where a woman named Sarah Crane had lived and vanished, where the earth kept its secrets in depths no lantern could illuminate. And if anyone had been watching, but no one was, they might have seen lights appearing in that empty space. Windows glowing warm and welcoming, a chimney trailing smoke, a woman hanging laundry in the starlight, her movements patient and eternal. The house was there, had always been there, would always be there, just not in the world that humans could touch. 3 months later, in a boarding house in St. Louis, Missouri, Thomas Merrick received a letter. The envelope was dirty, creased, the postmark barely legible, Junction City, Kansas. Inside was a single sheet of paper in Edward Finch's precise handwriting. "Mr. Merrick, I am going back. Not because I want to, but because I must. The dreams have become unbearable. Every night I see the well. Every night I hear them calling. I have completed my documentation. Copies are with the university, with the Federal Land Office, with the Smithsonian Institution. Whether anyone believes me is no longer my concern. What I have learned is this: the land remembers everything. Every footstep, every house, every life. We think we conquer it, claim it, make it ours, but the land was here first and will be here last, and it keeps a record of all who pass across its surface. Sarah Crane is not dead, neither is her husband, neither is Samuel Anderson, or the 11 families before them, or the countless others the earth has taken. They exist in the memory of the land itself, in a space we cannot reach except by surrendering everything we are. I suspect you know this already. I suspect you feel it too, that pull, that whisper in the quiet moments calling you back. I cannot resist it any longer. God, have mercy on us all." Edward Finch Thomas read the letter 3 times, then burned it in the fireplace. He didn't tell Catherine. She was pregnant now, finally able to sleep through the night without nightmares. He wouldn't burden her with this. But Finch was right. Thomas did feel it. Every day, the pull grew stronger. In his dreams, he walked those Kansas plains. In his dreams, he stood at the edge of the well and looked down into depths that went on forever. In his dreams, Sarah Crane smiled at him and said, "It's not so bad, Thomas. Once you stop fighting, once you let go." He began to research carefully, quietly, went to the library and read everything he could find about the American frontier, about the indigenous peoples who'd lived there first, about the land itself. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Across the Great Plains, there were places, nexus points, boundaries. The Kansas people had known them. So had the Pawnee, the Osage, the Wichita. They'd marked them, avoided them, respected them. And then the settlers had come, with their surveying equipment and their property deeds and their absolute certainty that land could be owned, controlled, possessed. The land had other ideas. Thomas found references to 17 sites, just as Finch's map had shown, but when he looked more carefully, he found hints of others. 37, 52, scattered across Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, the Dakotas, always in the same type of location, flat, open, unremarkable, easy to overlook, until something went missing. In April of 1889, 1 year to the day after Sarah Crane's house vanished, Thomas read a small notice in the St. Louis newspaper. A farmhouse in Nebraska had disappeared overnight. No trace, just an empty foundation and a well that seemed to have no bottom. The local authorities were baffled. The neighbors reported seeing the house the day before. A family of 5 had lived there. All gone. Thomas put down the paper with shaking hands. It was still happening, still feeding. The land patient and eternal, collecting its due from those who thought they could tame it. Catherine found him that evening, staring out the window at the Mississippi River flowing past the city. "You're thinking about going back," she said quietly. He turned, startled. "No, Don't lie to me, Thomas. I see it in your face. I feel it too. Not as strong as you, but I feel it." She placed a hand on her swollen belly. "And I won't let it take our child. It won't. We're free of it. We left." "Did we?" Catherine moved to stand beside him, her reflection joining his in the window glass. "Or did it just let us go? For now?" Thomas had no answer. That night he dreamed again. But this time, the dream was different. He stood not at the edge of the well, but beside it. And standing with him was Sarah Crane and Robert Crane and Samuel Anderson, and people he didn't recognize but somehow knew, the 11 families, the countless others. They weren't ghosts. They were solid, real, more real than anything in the waking world, and they were smiling. "You can fight it," Sarah said. "Some do, for years, decades even. But the land always wins. It has time, all the time in the world." "What happens if I come back?" Thomas heard himself ask. "You join us, become part of the memory, part of the land itself." Sarah gestured around them, and Thomas realized they were standing in her house, the one that had vanished. But it existed here, in this place between places, complete and whole and eternal. "Is it painful?" he asked. "No," Robert Crane answered. "It's like coming home, after a long journey. It's rest." Thomas woke with the sun streaming through the boarding house window. Catherine was already up, making breakfast on the small stove in their room. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air. Normal, domestic, safe. He made a decision then. He would not go back, would not let the land have him. He had a wife, a child on the way, a future that didn't involve vanishing into the hungry earth. But he also knew the truth. The choice might not be his to make. The land was patient. The land remembered. And the land always collected what it was owed. The farmhouse where Sarah Crane once lived remains empty to this day, or rather, the space where her farmhouse stood remains empty. The land itself has never been resold. Records show it as administratively held, tied up in legal complexities that no one seems motivated to resolve. The well is still there, covered now supposedly, though locals report that the cover never stays in place. Something always dislodges it. Wind, animals, time itself. Edward Finch's body was found 3 miles from the site in the summer of 1889. No cause of death was determined. His research papers, filed with various institutions, were largely dismissed as the ravings of a man who'd spent too much time alone on the prairie. Thomas and Catherine Merrick had 2 children in St. Louis. Thomas worked as a clerk until his death in 1923 at the age of 71. Catherine outlived him by 12 years. Neither ever returned to Kansas. But Thomas's journals, discovered after his death, tell a different story. Page after page of entries describing dreams, visions. The pull of something vast and patient calling him home. The last entry, written 3 days before he died, reads simply, "I can see the house now. Even with my eyes open, Sarah is standing in the doorway. She's smiling. She's been waiting. All this time, she's been waiting." Today, that section of Kansas remains sparsely populated. The neighboring farms report good harvests, healthy livestock, no problems. But few people stay for more than a generation. Something about the land, they say. Something that feels watchful. There are 17 documented sites like this across the Great Plains. Maybe more. Places where the boundary between what is and what was grows thin, where the earth remembers everything and forgets nothing, where houses can disappear at sunrise, leaving only questions and an emptiness that echoes deeper than any well. The land is patient, the land is hungry, and the land is still here, stretching from horizon to horizon, waiting for the next family to lay their claim, to build their house, to press their existence into soil that remembers everything. At sunrise, one house was missing. How many more will follow? If this story left you unsettled, you're not alone. The truth is often stranger and darker than any fiction. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we have more documented mysteries from America's frontier that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the land beneath your feet. And tell us in the comments, would you build a house on cursed ground if the price was right? Or is some land better left unclaimed? Thanks for watching. Sleep well, if you can.